So there's that clash, the Battle of Britain, the clash of air forces. What explains the success of Britain in defending?
Well, I mean, and everyone always says, the few were the last line of defense against the Nazi hordes and all this kind of stuff. And it's all rubbish. They're the first line of defense. Second line of defense is the Royal Navy, which is the world's largest. And there is absolutely no chance on earth that a German invasion force made up of Rhine River barges, one out of every three is motorized and the other two aren't, is ever going to get successfully across the English Channel. And even if they did, they would be repulsed. I mean, it's just no chance. And it is often forgotten that while the Luftwaffe is coming over and bombing Britain every single day, so is the RAF going over and bombing Germany. And one of the problems that the Germans have is that these bombers need fighter protection. Fighter planes are there to protect the bombers. And they don't have much fuel. And the Messerschmitt 109E, the MEL, as the model is of 1940, is the mainstay of the German fighter force in the summer of 1940. And they don't have much fuel, so they need to conserve their fuel, which means they need to be as close to Britain as they possibly can, which is why the majority of them are all in airfields which are hastily created in July 1940 following the fall of France in the Pas-de-Calais, which is the closest point. That's where the channel is its narrowest and all the rest of it. And also in the northern Normandy. And that's where they're flying from. But what that means is that even if you're completely rubbish at bombing, which the British are in 1940, they haven't developed those navigational aids that create untold accuracy by the end of the war. In 1940, they don't have that luxury. It's a target-rich environment. I mean, you can barely miss if you go over to the Isle of, over to the Pas-de-Calais. I mean, it's just like one huge, great kind of hub of fighter airfields. And consequently, that means that every single German squadron, which only is 12 airplanes strong on establishment, and very often even fewer than that, always has to leave 2 airplanes behind to defend their own airfields. And it's really interesting when you look at kind of prisoner of war statements from Luftwaffe ground crew that have been downed. They're all bugged in a holding place called Trent Park. You can see the transcripts of these conversations. They're all going about how annoying it was that the RAF are over every night and they can't sleep. And, if only they just shut up and leave them alone and not bomb them. This is just part of the narrative of the Battle of Britain that's completely left out. It's always the stocky, the plucky few against the kind of the Nazi hordes and all the rest of it. And it's a complete misnomer. And by that time, aircraft production in Britain is massively outpacing the Germans. And the best ratio that the Germans achieve in 1940 is July 1940, when the British produced 496 new Hurricanes and Spitfires single-engine fighters, and the Germans only produced 240 single-engine fighters. That's the best ratio. And of course, that is the British outproducing the Germans 2-1. And what that means is by the end of October 1940, when the Battle of Britain is sort of, officially designated as being over, the single-engine fighter force of the Luftwaffe is less than 200 from 750 or whatever it was in the beginning of July, whereas the British fighter force had been 650 or whatever at the beginning of July is now well over 750.
And Britain is outproducing.
Yeah, by to a massive degree. And that continues. And, that is a ratio that just increases as the war progresses. I mean, Britain produces 132,500 aircraft in the Second World War. America produces 315,000.
So why is there this legend of the Luftwaffe?
Well, because it's the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg.
So it has to do with the Blitzkrieg.
It's all to do with the Blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe becomes the kind of the bogeyman of the Third Reich. They're blamed for everything, but that's because they're completely abused. They're the only part of the Third Reich's armed services, the only part of the Wehrmacht being the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force, that is in constant use the whole time, or constant abuse, I should say. In Britain and America, they rotate their pilots really, really carefully. By the time that you got the 8th Fighter Command, for example, part of the mighty 8th, the 8th Air Force operating in Britain. By the end of 1943, you would have in a squadron that would have 16. You would never have more than 16 airborne from a squadron at any one time. You would have 40 to 45 pilots to service 16 in the air, and similar number of aircraft, which means you're not overusing these guys. And what would happen is by that stage of the war, by 1943, a young fighter pilot coming to to a Thunderbolt squadron or a Mustang squadron, for example, at the end of 1943, beginning of 1944, he'd have 350 hours of consecutive flying. And because you can train in America, in Florida or California or Texas or wherever, you can process many, many more people because the training is much more intense, because you've got clear skies. So it's not a question of oh, we'd like to take you out Fritz this morning, but it's a bit cloudy and oh, the RAF are over, or the 8th Air Force are over, so we can't fly today. So in Germany, pilot training is constant, aircrew training is constantly being interrupted by the war, by shortage of fuel, by inclement weather, etc., etc. In America, you have none of those problems. And Britain, because of its global reach, also has training bases in what was Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Canada as well. And so you're able to process these guys much better. You're able to give them more training. So that when they come, they're absolutely the finished article as pilots. What they're not the finished article as is, say, a bomber pilot or as a fighter pilot. But that's okay, because you join your squadron of 40 other guys for 16 airborne, and the old hands kind of take you up a few times. So you arrive at, I don't know, let's say some airfield in Suffolk in East Anglia in England, and you'll have 10 days to 2 weeks acclimatizing, getting used to it. The old hands will put you through your paces, give you some tips. You can pick their brains during kind of while you're having some chow and listening on some briefings. Then the first mission you do will be a milk run over to France, where the danger is kind of pretty minimal, and you can build up your experience. So that by the time you're actually sent over on a mission to Berlin or Bremen or the Ruhr or whatever, you're absolutely the business. So qualitatively and quantitatively, you are just vastly superior to anything the Luftwaffe's got. The Luftwaffe by that stage, in contrast, 1940, new pilots coming to frontline squadrons with 150, 170 hours in their logbooks. Less than 100, 90, 92 hours, something like that. It's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just being flung straight into battle, and they're getting absolutely slaughtered. And they're also, because their machines are quite complicated, there's no two-seaters really. So no two-seater trainers. So the first time you're flying in your Focke-Wulf 190 or your Messerschmitt 109, it's this horrendous leap of faith for which you, as a young, bright Luftwaffe fighter pilot, know that you're not ready for this. And it can bite you. Something like a Messerschmitt 109 has a very high wing loading. So it's very maneuverable in the air, but it's got these tiny wings. It's got this incredible torque, this Daimler-Benz DB605 engine with its huge amount of torque, and it just wants to flip you over. So if you're not used to it, and it's got a narrow undercarriage as well, if you're not used to it, you could just crash. So in the first couple of months of 1944, they lose something like 2,400 aircraft in the air and pilots, and about 3,400 are accidents.
So it has to do with training, really.
Yeah.
Not training enough.
It's training and resources and supply. And the Second World War, more than any other conflict, is a war of numbers. There are differences, the decisions that generals can make. There are moments where particular brilliance and bravery can seize the day, take the bridge, hold the enemy at bay or whatever. But ultimately, you're talking about differences which might make a month's difference, 6 months difference, maybe even several years difference. But ultimately, there's a certain point in the Second World War where the outcome is absolutely inevitable, because the guys that lose can't compete with the numbers that the guys are going to win at.
So in that sense, you could think of World War II as a battle of factories.
Yes.